So hello, everyone. Welcome to Fossil Free Eugene's webinar on the benefits of electrification in Eugene. My name is Aya Cockram. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the coalition coordinator for Fossil Free Eugene and Lane County, and will be your moderator for this evening's panel. I want to thank our amazing panel of experts for their time, for sharing their knowledge and the work they are each doing. And I also want to say a big thank you to the participants, all of you who are taking the time to learn about and discuss this important issue for our community. So first, I wanted to take a moment, and if I'm glancing sideways, it's because I have my notes over here. Sorry about that. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that we are broadcasting to you from stolen land. Kalapuya, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following the treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, the community of Oregon, and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions to their communities and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. So of course, words are great, but actions are better. I wanted to also acknowledge that we are going to be talking about justice in this presentation, and that is a really key part of that campaign and something that we do try and pay close attention to while we're doing this work for the climate. All right, so, oops. Our program this evening, I will begin with an overview of Fossil Free Eugene, what we are about and where we are now, and then we will hear from each of the panelists who I will introduce shortly. We have allotted ample time for questions at the end of the panel, and we will wrap up promptly at 7:30 to respect everyone's time. So I have a few notes for housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, just to let everyone know. And also to tell you that it will also be made available to view after the webinar, if you would like to review it or if you think anyone else would benefit from watching it. So you may choose to participate in the poll that I have launched. It's just a little poll to see who is in our audience and what the general temperature is of everyone in the room. Totally optional and anonymous if you're interested in participating. Please don't attempt to unmute until you're asked to unmute. I think actually I have to unmute you, but I just wanted to flag that for everyone. We're all going to stay muted during the presentations. And please do not use the chat for questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A and there's a chat. And so the Q&A is the place to put your questions. If you don't put them there, then it is likely that they may get lost within the chat. So please use those functions differently. I also wanted to say that we will have a Q&A at the end of all of the panelists. So please wait, and so you can post in the Q&A throughout the presentations, and the questions will collect there, and then we will address all of them during the question portion of the evening at the end. You can also, during that question portion, raise your hand if you would like to actually speak, and we can unmute you at that time so you can ask your question or make your comment yourself. Yes, so I do also want to say that if there are any unanswered questions or if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact me. I'll be providing my email at multiple points during the presentation. And of course, we ask that everyone remain respectful at all times. We want this to be a safe and open discussion, and we recognize that there will be a diversity of viewpoints represented in our audience tonight. All righty. So I believe we can now move into the meat and potatoes. So I wanted to give you a little background and tell you a little bit about Fossil Free Eugene. So Fossil Free Eugene was kind of born out of this moment when the city's franchise agreement with Northwest Natural expired about 3 years ago. The expiration provided our community with an opportunity to discuss the role of the gas utility in the city's greenhouse gas emissions. And this is where the coalition kind of was born. The coalition was built in November 2020 to advocate for the transition off of gas and other fossil fuels. We were represented by over 15 groups, which represents tens of thousands of members across the city and the county. Contact us if any of you on the webinar, if you represent a group or organization that would be interested in joining the coalition. Over the past 2 years and a bit, our coalition has been working tirelessly, giving many hundreds of public comments at council meetings, individual meetings with city councilors and the mayor, as well as holding many events and rallies and such. I wanted to add that although I'm now a part of the campaign, the vast majority of these efforts were and are volunteered by our busy coalition members, making it truly a grassroots effort fueled by so much passion and drive. So the platform. We have a kind of a threefold platform, and there are also kind of stages in our campaign. The first, which we will be talking about, focusing on this evening, is mandating that new construction be all electric in the city starting in 2023. The second is transitioning all utilities in the city to be 100% renewable energy by 2030. And the third is creating a fund to transition low-income and historically marginalized communities from fracked gas to electric appliances and retrofit homes to increase efficiency. We wanted to tackle this issue of transitioning to renewable energy holistically. And so this threefold platform addresses the multiple sides of this issue. We are trying to stop the growth of fossil fuel use by helping to push through an ordinance to transition new buildings to all electric construction. We are trying to make sure that energy is renewable and clean. And this task is made easy with EWEB's leadership. And finally, we are steadfast in our belief that a just transition is the only transition, that we must make sure that the disproportionate harms that the climate crisis and pollution have on frontline and historically marginalized communities is left in the past with gas. Our coalition is on track to, there are many other communities that have tackled this. I think a lot of people worry about, different repercussions of what moving forward on building electrification may be for a community. How will this work? Will it affect me negatively? But Eugene is following the example of many other cities who are currently working on or who have already passed similar legislation. Over 50 cities in California, New York, and Seattle have all done this, and the sky has not fallen. And we are poised to be leaders in the state. It is particularly important, however, for us to push forward on this ordinance because it would make Oregon the first in the state to do so, and it would position us as a climate leader and set an example for others to follow. Similar campaigns are already launching in Multnomah County, and the policy is in the works in cities in Southern Oregon, including Ashland. So I wanted to highlight these two motions that were passed in November 2021. Our council put us on track to lead the state last November by passing these two motions. The first was to direct staff to explore legal pathways to require that all new construction be 100% electric by January 1, 2023. And the second was to create a roadmap for comprehensive and equitable electrification of our existing building stock by 2045 to be presented to council in June of 2022. So it's just around the corner. It could be any day now. Very, very exciting. So we're really looking forward to that report, which should be coming out soon and will help us develop policy to make this transition off fossil fuels more just. And I wanted to acknowledge that there are a number of city councilors and I believe the mayor on the call this evening, who have really helped push this forward by passing these motions. And I want to thank them for their openness in learning more about what the possibilities are for our city and how we can electrify. All right, so here's the important stuff, the proposed ordinance. So I kind of wanted to lay it out so that we can really see what is it exactly we're wanting to do here. So we are proposing an ordinance that mandates that all new buildings be all electric. So that's very important. Existing businesses, we're not worrying about that right now. We're only worrying about new construction. And I wanted to define what we see as new construction for you all as a building that has never before been used or occupied for any purpose. So, and we are talking about this for residential, commercial, and industrial buildings. So this does not apply to portable gas appliances or gas infrastructure that is exclusively used for backup electrical generators. And we are aiming for a January 1, 2023 start date for this. I also wanted to highlight that the ordinance shall not be construed as requiring use or installation of any specific appliance as a condition of approval, nor shall it be construed as requiring use of a method of construction for the newly constructed building. So it's really just about, it's really focused on that new infrastructure. Something else I really wanted to highlight, because one of the reasons why we're having this webinar is because there are so many questions and maybe some concerns floating around in the community about what this would mean for businesses. So the way that we are working on that question is by proposing an infeasibility waiver. So an infeasibility waiver provides case-by-case exemptions for portions of projects where the all-electric requirement is deemed to be physically infeasible. So physically infeasible means the technology or other non-cost factors make a project unsuitable for its intended purpose. Fossil Free is recommending this solution for exceptional cases, such as businesses that require gas for key purposes like coffee roasters, brewers, and more. However, we are recommending that businesses that qualify for this infeasibility waiver do build buildings that are all electric ready, which means that they have the capabilities to go all electric when that technology does become available. So this is, we're not pulling this out of thin air. It is modeled after similar processes that are already in places like Petaluma, Sacramento, Berkeley, and others. And I'm not going into a lot of detail here because it is really important, but also will be discussed further at our next webinar, which we will be announcing the date of soon. And I will tell you a little bit more about that later as well. All right. So I also wanted to take a moment to kind of, if I'm talking about what we're doing now and what is happening in our campaign, I have to also talk about the opposition. Northwest Natural, the gas utility, is a multi-million-dollar company who is using their resources and in some case ratepayer dollars, which I believe Bob will be talking about more later, to fund misleading ad campaigns that impede the democratic process. They greenwash their products by overselling the benefits of renewable gas and have even gone so far as to advertise for children, for a product that is disproportionately harmful to young lungs, which will also be talked about more later. So there's a lot of news stories coming out about this right now. And if anyone is interested in reading more about that, please contact me. I can send you links. Methane gas companies have a very well-funded, if misleading, narrative that convince people. So it's important that we come out equally strong with a counter narrative. And so we work, we try and publish as much as we can with local news and get the word out there to try and counter this narrative and provide fact-based, science-based information about what is best for our community in the future. So just really briefly wanting to talk about what's next for us. So we are hopeful that we can, so there has been an electrification work session scheduled by City Council for July 25th. So we are asking that at that electrification work session, a draft ordinance be that council directs staff to draft an ordinance to mandate that new construction be all electric starting in January 1, 2023. We are then hoping that a draft ordinance will be presented to council and that a public forum will be held, and then city council may vote on that ordinance. So that is kind of the pathway forward for us, and ideally what will happen. So enough of me talking. I now want to introduce to you our wonderful panel of experts representing a number of key areas of concern when considering the implications and benefits of building electrification. I will introduce them in the order that they will present. Okay, first we have Beth Doglio, who will be focusing on the climate benefits of electrification. Beth is a former state representative, community organizer, climate leader, and mother of two. She was the first executive director of Washington Conservation Voters and later went on to serve 13 years as the campaign director for climate solutions. She served in the Washington State Legislature from 2017 to 2021, passing the nation's first commercial building standard and helping secure millions of dollars for clean energy projects across the state. She is currently working on building decarbonization efforts on behalf of climate solutions in both Oregon and Washington. Thank you so much for being here, Beth. So after Beth, we will hear from Eloise Navarro to learn more about the justice issues surrounding the transition off of fossil fuels. Eloise is the Environmental and Climate Justice Coordinator for the Eugene Springfeild NAACP. As a queer Filipino-American grassroots organizer, she works towards environmental and climate justice by centering frontline communities. At the NAACP, she works on energy justice, transportation equity, and community resilience and empowerment. Collective liberation, community building, and cultural sovereignty are at the core of her organizing principles. So glad to have you, Eloise. Then we will have Dr. Melanie Plaut speak to us about the health impacts of gas. Melanie retired from her OBGYN practice in 2016. She has since then worked on issues relating to the climate crisis, especially where it intersects with health. She works with 350 PDX and the Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, as well as other organizations. Thank you for being here with us, Melanie. And finally, we will hear from Bob Jenkins, who will look at the impacts on ratepayers in both the short and long term. Bob is the executive director of the Oregon Citizens Utility Board, or CUB. He has participated in nearly every major Oregon Public Utility Commission case since he started in 1991, including dozens of cases dealing with utility mergers, rates, resources, planning, and climate change. Bob sits on the board of the Environment Oregon and Research Policy Center and is the Oregon representative at the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. He is a native Oregonian and holds a degree in economics from Willamette University. So as you can see, a very, very impressive lineup of guests with us tonight. And I will now turn the floor over to Beth.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try and share my PowerPoint here. Does that look good?
It looks great.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here to talk about this really important issue, the future of buildings, clean, safe, and all electric. I'm really excited about the work going on in Eugene and across the country and in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. So I imagine you wouldn't be here if you weren't really concerned about the climate crisis like I am. I've devoted a lot of my professional life to trying to combat the climate crisis that we are in. And as you know, we are in a very significant, and while we're sitting here freezing in the Pacific Northwest, our neighbors in the Midwest, where I grew up, are experiencing a very significant heat dome that is threatening vulnerable lives in there. And it's just one thing after another. Our extreme weather events just continue to get more and more extreme. And in fact, the Oregon Health Authority issued a report, Climate Plus Health, in Oregon 2020, and they make it very clear that it's It's about economic disruption, a public health crises, and it's also exacerbating our racial inequity in the state of Oregon. So we've talked a lot about how to deal with this issue. We've talked about, our electric sector and greening our electric sector. We've talked about transportation. We've had a lot of focus on those kinds of things in the policy level. And so why buildings and why now? So let's just drill down a little bit and look at emissions from the built environment nationwide. They are on the rise in a very significant way, unfortunately, and that's because of the use of natural gas for appliances in our homes. In fact, 1/3 of all gas consumption nationwide comes from buildings. And unfortunately, we are not stopping that, despite the fact that we have a significant climate crisis on our hands. And one house every minute is being hooked up to gas, totaling over 560,000 gas hookups every year nationwide. And that is exasperating our climate situation. It's not going the right way. So looking at Oregon and why focusing on buildings is so important and the work that's happening in Eugene is so important. The emissions from the buildings sector are very close to the emissions from transportation, which typically lead emissions in profiles and wedge analysis and all of that thing. So you can see that the green here is buildings, the blue is transportation. We also see much harder to address emissions in our industrial sector and our water and waste. And of course, there's lots of things that agriculture can be doing, and we're talking a lot more about solutions in the ag sector, soil science and all of that. But tonight's, we're going to focus on that green sector on buildings. Unfortunately, nobody's really in any of these sectors are making great strides in emission reductions in Oregon. You can see it's almost pretty much flatlined in all of those sectors. So the answer to that question is, unfortunately, no. Now, the good news, that's the bad news, but the good news is that Oregon actually is in pretty good shape in terms of having a policy framework and goals in place and some policies in place that really can set Oregon up and is setting Oregon up for success. So just starting with our own goals here in Oregon, the executive order issued by the governor 2004 did set new targets, and we're looking at an interim target of 45% below 2035, below 1990 levels by 2035, and at least 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Now that is a huge chunk of emissions. We have a lot of work to do, and there is no better time to start doing that work than right now, and Eugene has that opportunity. The other couple of things that were passed by the legislature or put in place by the governor, the climate protection program, that is actually saying to oil and gas companies, you got to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions really significantly. So it's put the gas company on notice about their need to reduce their emissions. In fact, they're required to reduce them 90% by 2050. And if we don't start now, we're certainly not going to be at that goal by 2050. In addition to that, the legislature passed a bill that requires the electric sector in Oregon to be 100% clean by 2040. We do, because of the hydro, we have a relatively carbon-free electric sector already, but getting to that 100% over the next couple of decades is going to be super important, because what we're trying to do is take things off of the fossil fuel, out of the fossil fuel sector and onto the electric grid. And so that's a really good thing, because our electric grid is just getting greener and greener by the day, by the year. And so as we move more and more things onto our electric sector, we're going to be reducing emissions and getting the most out of our efforts to reduce emissions. So just really taking a deep dive and looking at what does a house, an all electric house, actually look like? And sort of where do you get the most benefits in a home or in a commercial building? The furnace, I have a gas furnace, which I'm hoping to retrofit to an electric heat pump, is really the biggest contributor to emissions in our home. It uses the most energy, and there are a lot of gas furnaces out there, and we don't want to be creating any more of those, because on down the line, if you go back to those emission reductions that the state is requiring of our gas companies, that is going to require retrofit. So we might as well be doing it right in the first place. The second place is that water heating, and then you have those sort of little wedges there of cooking, pools, hot tubs, clothes dryers, that sort of thing. So I want to talk specifically a little bit about heat pumps, because Oregon did experience a very significant heat dome last summer. Hopefully we will avoid that this summer, but I imagine we will see more and more of that, just like the Midwest is experiencing right now as we speak. But heat pump systems have the real advantage of actually providing both heating and cooling at the same time. And unfortunately, because of adaptation to climate, we are going to need more cooling, particularly for vulnerable populations, but really for everyone. I mean, it was pretty miserable, and we can expect more of that. So heat pumps offer this dual benefit of heating and cooling all in one unit. It also saves money. RMI did a study looking specifically at Eugene and showed that it does save $1,600 in upfront construction costs. It costs money to hook up gas to homes or to commercial buildings. We can eliminate that. And it also showed that an all-electric home is about a $3,500 net cost savings over a 15-year period, just in terms of utility bill savings, the differential between gas costs and electric costs. And as we move off of gas and continue to do that, prices are likely to rise, right? Supply and demand. And so that will be a really important thing as we move forward to look at the costs. And certainly in new construction, building it right from the beginning, all electric is really the way to go. I just also want to talk, there's a lot of talk out there about the sky falling down. Aya mentioned it, that everything's going to go to heck, and we're going to have a lot of problems. Not all communities in the Pacific Northwest are served by gas companies. A lot of communities, all they have right now is electricity. I'll just take Wenatchee. I was on the phone today with a city council member from Wenatchee, from East Wenatchee, and we were talking about grid reliability issues and the fact that there's not heat pumps that deal with the cold weather in other parts of our state. But the fact of the matter is that people are already using these technologies, and they're working, and people are staying warm, and they're able to get through power outages, and the sky hasn't fallen down in those communities. So just remember that this isn't really something like crazy that we're talking about doing. A lot of communities already exist without having the option to hook up to a gas utility line. So we can lead in the Pacific Northwest, and in fact we are. Eugene is on the cutting edge of this in Oregon. Multnomah County, Portland Public Schools have passed really strong resolutions moving towards all electric buildings. The Washington State Building Code. So in Washington State, we had the biggest win that we've had yet on this issue for the nation. We have the strongest commercial building codes in the nation that basically require the use of heat pumps for water and for space statewide. And that goes into effect in July of 2023. And now we are working on residential codes. Other communities sort of led the way, which is what Eugene is doing here in this situation. Seattle Shoreline and Bellingham had passed these policies that we were able to get passed through the State Building Code Council as a precursor. So the work that you're doing at the local level in Eugene in terms of working to go fossil free is something that will build power from the bottom up, eventually moving to the state. So that's why your work at the local level is so important. I did want to take a minute to just mention the legislature did appoint a resilient, efficient buildings task force, and they are looking at a whole suite and array of of policies that address our built environment that will be introduced hopefully in the next session. So I mentioned this before, but I want to put a finer point on that. Building a house today with a gas appliance of any sort, that will last for many, many years and keep that gas infrastructure in place. So we really need to make sure that we're doing it right now as quickly as we possibly can for a cost issue. It just costs a lot more money to do it later than to do it right from the beginning. Just really want to drill down on that particular point. Oh, I thought I had an equity slide, but I don't. I did also want to say, I think it's really important as we move to Eloise, who's going to talk more specifically about equity, that as we move off of gas prices will rise. And it's really important that low-income homes that have gas furnaces get assistance with making that transition. And I know Eloise is going to go into more detail about that, but I think it's a really important part of the work that we're doing. And I really appreciate the attention that Fossil Free Eugene is paying to that piece of it. And I will pass it on to Eloise to tell us more about that.
Thank you so much, Beth. Yes, I just wanted to take a moment between panelists to say that I did launch the poll. It was not launched when I was saying it was. I apologize for that. So if you want to participate, you can. And I do see a hand raised, and I just wanted to remind everyone that we're saving questions till the end, but we see you and we will get to you if you leave your hand up or if you raise your hand during the chat session. So yes, I will turn it over to Eloise and get the slides going.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll just let you know when to switch slides. Thank you so much, Beth. Like Beth mentioned, I'll be getting into a little bit about mostly talking about who is impacted here. So for some of you, I think this, you might already know all of this, and that's okay. You'll get kind of a reiteration of what's going on. And for some folks, this might be a really important introduction to this equity or social and racial justice component to electrification. So if we could go to the next slide. This here is just kind of taking a minute to briefly define these really important terms that we're talking about. And so when we talk about environmental justice, at least will function under the definition from the US EPA. So according to the EPA, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so there are some different definitions, but we'll just use that one. It's pretty straightforward. And then one thing I'll probably be saying during the presentation is frontline communities. And so we'll define that as well. So these are groups that face a disproportionate burden of climate issues and that are most affected by environmental justices. So I'll mostly be focusing on BIPOC folks in low income, but it's important to note that other folks that might be considered frontline communities include people with disabilities, children and youth, the elderly, the unhoused, outdoor workers, incarcerated populations, and immigrants. And so you might be thinking to yourself, it's a pretty long list. I might even fall under that, which is a completely appropriate response because lots of folks are impacted in very, very different ways. But today I'll mostly be focusing on the racial and low income component, particularly how Black populations experience environmental injustices. And then we'll go to the next slide. And this is just a little bit of helpful background to kind of give some context into why these problems might be existing today or even increasing. And so what we're really talking about is environmental racism. And so folks might know Dr. Robert Bullard, and he defines environmental racism as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages intended or intended individuals, groups, or communities based on race. And so we're going to talk a lot about that today. And this, folks probably know about redlining, which was an extremely discriminatory practice that has been used historically, really to prevent racial and ethnic minorities and low-income residents from being able to live in healthy neighborhoods and places by denying them services. And so and this is something that, even though is technically done or doesn't exist anymore, totally still has continued effects. And so some of the outcomes of environmental racism includes concentration of air pollution, toxic waste sites, landfills, lead poisoning, and other industrial complexes, less tree coverage, and less safe and unwalkable neighborhoods. And so on this next slide, I really wanted to highlight, some folks might be thinking that Eugene doesn't experience this. We're a pretty green city. And I wanted to use tree equity kind of as an example to show that this is very much still continuing today. So this is from a website that kind of calculates cities' tree equity scores. And so orange is bad and green is okay. And so if you go to this website and you click on any of these neighborhoods or communities, it'll tell you the kind of different factors. And what you'll find is that lots of these orange or these low tree equity scores overlap with low income and BIPOC, predominantly BIPOC neighborhoods. And so this is also true of, this is looking specifically at tree coverage, but is generally true for pollution and other factors of environmental injustices as well. So just wanted to give that visual. So we can continue to the next one. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about how BIPOC communities and households are impacted by kind of indoor air pollution. Again, focusing more so on the Black community, but many of these are also true to a certain extent for other non-Black communities as well. And so many of the chronic diseases exacerbated by unhealthy or inadequate housing conditions certainly occur at higher rates among low-income Black and Indigenous families. And here are a few statistics that might help put this into perspective. These statistics that I'm going to share are for the United States, but eventually I'll show how they apply a bit more specifically to Eugene. And so Black children suffer from asthma at around double the rate of white children. And according to US Census data, low-income households make up around 37% of respondents, but represent more than half of the households with inadequate housing conditions. When it talks about inadequate housing conditions, that's talking about some of the systems and appliances that Beth was just talking about earlier: heating, cooling, cookware, all of that. And then Black families are 60% more likely than white families to be living with these inadequate housing conditions. And then Black and Latinx people on average vary pollution burden of 50 to 60% more exposure relative to the exposure actually caused by their consumption. And to compare that with white folks experience 17% less the exposure than is caused by their consumption. So that's just pointing out how disproportionate these impacts truly are. And so we'll jump to the next slide. And this is looking at low income. And just a disclaimer that, low income and BIPOC, I've separated them, but often there's lots of overlap. So I want to make that clear. And so low income households spend a really large portion of their monthly income on electricity, gas, and heating. So while the average American household might spend about 3.5% of their income on utilities, this percentage turns to about 10% for low-income households. And so at the same time, low-income households have the least access to energy efficient appliances or other clean energy technologies. And so one thing that, the Fossil Free Eugene Coalition is working to do, I myself in my position at the NAACP is working to actually make those accessible, because it's not something that is inherently included in a lot of environmental policy. So that's really important. And then speaking of improvements, and Beth had mentioned really importantly that, the money aspect and that this actually saves money. So Oregon state agencies estimate that energy efficiency improvements like improved heating, cooling, weatherization can save over $100 million per year in utility costs for low-income households. And so not only are we working to kind of be able to hopefully eventually provide these changes for low-income folks, the switch itself is just extremely important, and that's a really important aspect of making this equitable for more communities and populations. And so we can go to the next one. Like I said, I wanted to kind of also look at this very directly in Eugene as well. And there might be some folks that are either with Beyond Toxics or might know about the work that they do, but they're another Oregon Eugene that does really amazing climate and environmental justice work. And so they've got a campaign looking specifically at West Eugene community health and air pollution. And so according to the reports and studies that they've done, and also actually before getting to that, according to the EPA's National Air Toxics Assessment, Oregon has the third largest population at risk of excess cancer due to air pollution. And a lot of that is concentrated when we look at Eugene specifically in one place. But before getting to that, exposure to this air pollution has been linked to some pretty intense and inequitable impacts, including premature death, higher prevalence of lung disease, decreased productivity in school and work, lost earnings, and school absences. So it's not just a health issue. It really, this really expands across many different sectors of social well-being. And so when we look specifically at West Eugene, 550,000 pounds of toxic emissions were released in 2019. And this pollution, which was emitted in just one zip code area, accounted for 96% of all emissions released in the city of Eugene that year and every year. And so what I'm trying to show here is that these national statistics about low-income communities, Black communities, and other BIPOC communities, it is very relevant to Eugene. And so even though Eugene is a predominantly white city, BIPOC and low-income communities still continue to face the disproportionate impact, and it is alive and well. And so electrification is extremely important when we talk about these equity issues and indoor air pollution. And so this last slide I have is Aya had mentioned a just transition earlier and how we need it. And so really we're talking about an equitable movement into a more just society using, and it might be hard to see all of the aspects here, but thinking about including equitable systems, equitable processes as we do that. And so electrification is just one piece of the puzzle, but for Eugene is an extremely important one, as we see in some of those statistics. And so I won't go through and explain this whole diagram, but it's definitely really interesting. I imagine you can look it up. But it's really just talking about going from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. And one of the ways that we can achieve that and achieve healthy communities is to empower folks, work with folks to respond and prevent further damage of fossil fuels, rather than continue or react inappropriately to how we're currently functioning as a fossil fuel society. Alrighty, I think that's the end of mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eloise. That the social environmental justice piece really spans across what everybody is talking about, but really wonderful to have you dial it in and make it specific for Eugene for us. Thank you. And I will now turn it over to Melanie Plaut.
All right, let me just get this. There we go. All right, so stoves. A lot of us love our gas stoves, but the sad thing is they are kind of awful for our health. Now, why would we emphasize and talk so much about gas stoves if we're really worried about the climate? As Beth said, it's just a tiny sliver of the climate emissions that gas appliances have in our buildings. But there are really two reasons. First of all, the stove is the only gas appliance that isn't required to be vented outside. And because of that, we have a concentration of the pollutants indoors that have more direct health effects on us than when they are emitted outdoors. Although I want to emphasize that all of the same emissions in large quantities from our furnaces, our hot water heaters, and any other gas appliances do harm us in the outside air too. The second reason to emphasize gas stoves is because people don't really love their furnaces. Nobody cares. Nobody's attached to their gas water heater. It's usually in the basement. You don't really see it. But a lot of people do love their gas stoves. And so we need to have people understand some of the downsides of gas stoves. So I think you can see that there are some significant pollutants produced by gas stoves. And I'm going to talk about each of these individually. Particulate matter, otherwise known as PM 2.5, carbon monoxide, which you're probably familiar with, formaldehyde, a chemical nobody loves, and the one that we have the most information is nitrogen dioxide. So I'll be talking a lot about nitrogen dioxide. Okay, let's get this going. Now, when you burn methane indoors, you are creating many of the same substances that are in exhaust from your gas car. So the particulate matter, the carbon monoxide, and the nitrogen dioxide. You can see those are kind of familiar to you already. Now, to be clear, any kind of cooking creates particulate matter. This isn't something that's exclusive to cooking with a gas stove. But at least some studies have shown that when you cook with the gas stoves, the amount of particulate matter is higher than with an electric stove. And you get all these bonuses. You get nitrogen dioxide, you get carbon monoxide, you get formaldehyde, and some other volatile organic compounds. Now, particulate matter is the silent killer. It's these tiny, tiny particles that are so small. When we breathe, they travel deep into our lungs and into our bloodstream. I mean, really, it's kind of nasty when you think about it. If you're burning onions or something like that, and little pieces of that burnt particulate matter are going down into your lungs. The fact is that everything we burn, we breathe. And it's been said that the era that we've been in for the last several hundred years should really be called the Pyrocene, when we got our energy from burning things. And now that we have so many people on this planet and we are burning so many things, we have reached the limit of our ability to provide that energy safely by burning. So there are a lot of health effects from particulate matter. There are some acute effects. So if you are in your home and you're exposed to the particulate matter from your stove, it increases your blood pressure and your risk of stroke. There's also chronic exposure to particulate matter, which contributes to premature mortality, meaning you die sooner, asthma, and then some effects, which this always rings for me as a former obstetrician, premature births and low birth weight babies. I'm going to pass pretty quickly over formaldehyde, no safe level, known carcinogen and lung irritant, and carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide displaces oxygen. So the tissues with the highest oxygen needs are affected first. That would be the heart and the brain. And people who are most sensitive, like the elderly, the children, and fetuses, and those with underlying health conditions, are most sensitive to the effects of carbon monoxide. Now, in general, a properly adjusted stove shouldn't emit significant amounts of carbon monoxide, but if you are using a gas stove in your home, you should be absolutely sure that you have a working carbon monoxide detector, because as you know, carbon monoxide is odorless and you can't tell that it has reached dangerous levels until you have the effects of it. So I'm going to emphasize or spend the rest of the time really talking about nitrogen dioxide, otherwise known as NO2. On average, people in the US spend 90% of their time indoors, and yet the US has no indoor air quality standards for NO2. Now, gas stoves and ovens emit levels of NO2 at levels that would be illegal if they were emitted outdoors. So I want you to remember this number: over 100 parts per billion per hour in an hour would be illegal outdoors. Now, nitrogen dioxide levels are 50% to 400% higher in homes that cook with gas than those that cook with electric stoves. There was a recent study from Stanford that measured very accurately levels of nitrogen dioxide, and it rose to these levels, illegal outdoors, in less time than it takes to scramble an egg, so very quickly. Another interesting thing from the Stanford study was that stoves leak methane even when they are turned off. In fact, 75% of the methane that they leak is not when you're using them, it's all the time. That methane probably isn't a high enough level to cause a health risk or an explosion hazard, but it does contribute to the global warming. As you know, methane is one of our very strong climate forcers. So I'm going to focus on children. Children are more affected by these pollutants indoors because they have higher respiratory rates. That means they breathe more quickly, they're more active, and they have more lung surface compared to their body weight, and also have immature lung and immune systems. What this means is that there's a very well-established link between childhood asthma, nitrogen dioxide, and gas stoves. In fact, just today, the American Medical Association recommended the adoption of a resolution noting the dangers of gas stove and the links to asthma. Now, the AMA, this was an organization I never joined when I was actively practicing because I thought they were so conservative and boring. But even the AMA now agrees that there's a link with health and gas stoves. So asthma is the #1 chronic disease in children. And as I said, there are multiple studies. There was what we call a meta-analysis, which is a review of all those studies, showed that on average, there's a 42% increase in asthma symptoms for children who live in homes with gas stoves, and a 24% increased risks for lifetime asthma. And then there's some additional, I think, interesting evidence about childhood asthma and nitrogen dioxide. So there was a study in the citations at the bottom. Kids who have asthma when they measure the NO2 levels, the symptoms are worse with NO2 levels as low as 6 parts per billion. You remember that you scramble an egg, it can go over 100 parts per billion. So even these very, very low levels cause worsening symptoms at each 5 parts per billion. This is always very strong evidence in medicine when you have what's called a dose response, when you give more of something and it makes a symptom worse. Secondary evidence comes from California, and this was a longitudinal study over 20 years. Nitrogen dioxide improved over that period of time, mostly because of pollution controls on cars, and childhood asthma rates dropped in tandem with the lower level. So if you look at different cities and when the pollution controls were put in place, the cities where it dropped the fastest had the fastest decline in childhood asthma rates. Again, very strong evidence of childhood asthma's connection to nitrogen dioxide. So you might be saying, well, you know, my kid doesn't really spend any time in the kitchen. I'm not too worried. But I think this is a really interesting study. The red lines are the measurement of NO2 in the kitchen. So they turned on the gas oven, it went way up, fell slightly over the next couple hours, then they cooked. But the blue line is the level in the bedroom. So this kid who's not even in the kitchen is being exposed to levels of nitrogen dioxide that are higher than what would be allowed outdoors. Now, there are other health effects of nitrogen dioxide, which are pretty well known. Again, it increases all-cause mortality. It's been associated with lung and breast cancer, adverse pregnancy outcomes, worsening of lung conditions, and various cognitive and learning deficits. Higher levels of nitrogen dioxide have been associated, and this is outdoor NO2 levels in various cities, increased Alzheimer's, teenage depression, and bad calls by umpires. Now, this goes back a little bit to what Eloise was saying. Lower income households and people of color are more likely to be at risk for some of these health effects due to gas stove pollution because they may live in smaller units. They tend to live in multi-generational homes with more people. The homes are older. They may not have appropriate ventilation. They have higher exposure to outdoor pollution, maybe because they have to live where it's cheap and there are adjacent highways or industrial facilities. And they already have a greater burden for health conditions like asthma. Okay, so what are you going to do? You have a gas stove and you're worried. First of all, as I mentioned, you should have a carbon monoxide detector. If you have an exhaust hood, and many people either have no hood or have one of those fairly useless hoods that just recirculates the air in your kitchen, it doesn't actually go to the outside. And in any case, you should open a window while you're cooking. You should try to cook on the back burners as much as possible if you have a hood, because there's some evidence that then the pollutants are able to be removed more readily. But I think there is a limitation to putting the burden on the user to make the gas stove safe. We know that hood fans are noisy. A lot of the fans don't vent outside, as I mentioned. And really, to be effective, they have to be used at the highest speed every single time that you cook. One survey in California showed that fan use at best was 42% in people who had gas stoves. So even people who have a well-functioning fan may not use it. And then this was a very interesting study from Baltimore. It was a randomized trial to try to decrease nitrogen dioxide in low-income folks who had gas stoves. And they had 3 different interventions that they randomized people to. Number 1, they put in a hood, a really good hood that went to the outside. Number 2, they put in a carbon filter to remove some of the pollutants. Or number 3, they replaced their gas stove with an electric stove. And it turned out that there was no significant decrease at 3 months in the NO2 levels. The carbon filter helped a little bit, but the electric stove decreased the ambient nitrogen dioxide by half in 3 months. So I think there's good evidence that if you rely on people, you're putting the burden on the user to use the ventilation, it's probably at a population level not as effective. This is a slightly different study, but was also interesting to me. The National Center for Healthy Housing looked at similar populations, and they did some improvements in weatherization and other things in half the homes. The other half, they tried to bring the continuous mechanical ventilation into the home, meeting what's called ASHRAE standards. And they did decrease a lot of the pollutants that we've talked about. They decreases particulate matter, carbon dioxide, but interestingly enough, there was no improvement in nitrogen dioxide. They're not really able to explain this, but in doing a little poking around, I did find that nitrogen dioxide is heavier than air, and it's possible that we don't remove it quite as effectively with mechanical ventilation as some of the other pollutants. So we all want clean and safe homes. What should you do if you're still cooking with methane gas? Well, as I mentioned, use your fan hood religiously. Don't be like me, like I used to be, and only turn on the hood when I was, frying fish or something. You can use electric appliances, maybe some that you already have, like a microwave or an electric kettle or an Instant Pot. It turns out that single hob plug-in induction burner plates are relatively affordable. And one that's quite highly rated is the Duxtop 9600, somewhere around $100. And then, of course, when you can, replace your gas stove with an electric or an induction stove. So in summary, burning methane indoors is not good for our health. Induction stoves, I'm just going to say, are cool. And I mean that in two ways. They're neat, and they also are much cooler. They don't heat up your kitchen as much. They're safer for the elderly and for children. This is my relatively recently installed induction cooktop, and I love it. It boils water twice as fast as my gas stove used to. You can turn the heat down immediately, like you can with a gas stove, and you can simmer at very, very low levels without worrying about boil over. There are some possible downsides to induction stove. They are somewhat more expensive, although every time I turn around, I see more and more affordable options coming on the market. You might need an electrician to put in the right kind of circuit. It's kind of like your dryer. You need to have one of those 220 lines. And not all cookware will work, although cast iron works great. A few brief words about induction for commercial kitchens. It is becoming more common that commercial kitchens are moving to induction. Some of the reasons: much easier to clean after use. Things don't get burned on because you're only heating the pot. You're not heating the stove itself. You can increase or drop the temperature more quickly, and you don't heat up the whole room. I guess commercial, I've never worked in a commercial kitchen, but I think they get really hot, and people spend a lot of money trying to air condition them. But if you were using induction stoves, you wouldn't have quite as much difficulty. And there are no open flames, so less risk of burns. Just a word or two, our gas usually comes from fracking. A high percentage of it in Oregon does. And living near a fracking site in multiple studies has been linked to adverse birth outcomes. And then, of course, the methane is one of the strongest climate forcers we have, and cutting it is one of the strongest levers that we have to slow climate change over the next decade. So if we don't want to see the forest fires from 2 summers ago or the heat dome from last year, it behooves us to try to cut back on as much methane use as quickly as possible. My summary of all of this is that getting off fossil fuels is not a sacrifice. We can have healthier homes and better air quality. And I'm going to leave it at that and turn it over to Bob.
Thank you so much, Dr. Plaut. That was Very scary and also very informative and helpful. Thank you so much. So yes, we will be hearing from our last panelist this evening, Bob Jenks, and I am just pulling up the PowerPoint and I will turn it over to you, Bob.
Great, thank you. And I'll try to go quickly so there's some time for questions, which I think are the most interesting part of some of these presentations. You can go to the next slide. I'm Bob Jenks. I'm the Executive Director of Oregon CUB. We're an independent nonprofit advocating for residential utility customers. We're trying to help with the transition and create affordable, accessible, reliable, and clean energy for Oregon families. We were founded by a ballot initiative in 1984 because Oregonians wanted an advocate in the face of corporate utility interests. Our focus is on the regulation of for-profit utilities like Pacific Power and Northwest Natural, and statewide energy policy like the 100% clean electricity bill. We don't get involved in rates and planning for consumer-owned utilities like EWEB, Sub, or Emerald. Can you go to the next slide? I've been involved in the Northwest Natural rate case. They're proposing to increase rates by 12% this fall after an increase last fall of 13%. And we're expecting another significant increase as when they add in their commodity costs this fall, which when you combine these two, they'll reflect a total of about a 30% increase in 13 months. Gas costs are going up, though we're doing what we can to push back against those. I recently submitted testimony to the PUC talking about the challenges to the gas business model from heat pump technology, climate, and cost. But I really want to focus on the challenges to customers. Oregon's requiring, Oregon climate regulation requires a 50% reduction in emissions from a historic baseline by 2035. That's in 12 years. It's not a 50% reduction from expected 2035 emissions, but from an historic baseline. This means 100% of the emissions associated with new customers will have to be reduced. Because the gas companies want to keep growing their systems, we will have to reduce emissions by 69% from current usage to accommodate the growth in gas usage that the gas companies want. Gas companies are claiming that this growing the gas system is important to spread the costs over wider load, but at the same time, part of their gas decarbonization strategy is to reduce demand through expanded energy efficiency incentives. It doesn't make sense to invest in money in expanding the system at the same time we are spending money providing incentives to customers to reduce usage. Because expanding the system requires a subsidy. We are currently asking the PUC to eliminate the subsidy, but the gas company is fighting to preserve it. New residential customers with gas heat receive a $2,875 subsidy. The gas company, once they provide this subsidy, they then charge the system, the rest of the customers on the system for this subsidy, and they spread that out over 40 years. And by spreading it out over 40 years, they earn a profit on that over those 40 years. So every new customer on the gas system provides a 40-year string of shareholder profits. While the profit on each $2,800 subsidy is small, 10,000 customers are added, new customers are added each year, year after year. This adds up to millions and millions of dollars in profits every year from customers subsidizing growth. This has significant implications for customers. We are paying for the subsidy of the growth, we are paying for the profits on the subsidy, and we are having to pay for the cost of reducing the emissions from this new growth. If you're replacing a furnace or other gas equipment today, that gas equipment's useful life will almost entirely be during this time of rapid decarbonization of the gas system. And you're going to lock yourself into that system with a lot of uncertainty, particularly uncertainty in terms of cost. Can you go to the next slide? For the first question I want to ask, can the gas companies meet the basic goal of reducing carbon emissions by 69% from their current emissions by 2035? The plans that they submitted to the PUC rely on 3 tools: energy efficiency to reduce loads, including promotions and incentives on dual fuel heat pumps and natural gas heat pumps. Dual fuel heat pumps are electric heat pumps until the temperature gets near freezing. and they switch to a gas furnace. They reduce about 80% of the gas load for heating the building. They're a form of electrification. But they require you essentially purchase two separate types of heating, a gas furnace and an electric heat pump. Gas heat pumps don't actually exist on the market today. They exist in some labs, but they don't exist on the market. And it's not commercially available and may not ever be commercially available. But if it is, it's worth noting that to get them in place, they want to offer a lot of incentives, which we pay for customers to install gas heat pumps to reduce their usage, while we're also paying subsidies to grow the system. So they want us to subsidize reductions in gas use, and they want us to subsidize expansion of the gas use. The second strategy they have is renewable natural gas. Renewable natural gas costs 3 to 4 times what fossil gas costs. So adding renewable natural gas raises rates. But that's for the cheap renewable gas that comes from landfills, animal feedlots, and wastewater systems. To successfully decarbonize, they're going to have to get renewable gas from thermal gasification, which will cost much, much more, 10 to 20 times the cost of fossil gas. And then the third thing they're talking about is hydrogen. Northwest Naturals is working on a demonstration project here in Eugene. Hydrogen can be produced from electricity and can be added to gas pipelines, but it's expensive. But it's also less dense than natural gas. So most folks think the limit in a gas pipeline is about 20% hydrogen. Northwest Naturals has a goal to go beyond this by methanating the hydrogen. My understanding of this is that it's adding CO2 to the hydrogen to make it essentially methane. But this gets more expensive. And it's not clear what the source of CO2 is. It requires capturing CO2. And my guess is if you start capturing CO2, a lot of the climate activists will argue that the CO2 should be injected into the ground or otherwise stored rather than added to hydrogen, burned, and then emitted back into the atmosphere. So next, thank you. Reducing emissions by 69% by 2035 is a huge challenge to the gas utilities. Gas heat pumps may not be an option. They may not be able to increase efficiency to the degree that they plan. They may not be able to add enough renewable gas to meet the needs. It's important to note it's not just gas companies all over the country that are looking to renewable natural gas. So is freight and other things that aren't connected to the electric grid that need to find renewable and cleaner energy sources. And how much hydrogen can be added at what cost is a big open question. In addition, if they fail to meet these aggressive emission lists in the 69% by 2035, they're subject to penalties. Compare that to the electric side. First, in a place like Wayne County, with consumer-owned utilities like eWeb, Sub, and Emerald, you start with a pretty clean electric system. And the tools we have to further decarbonize the electric system are pretty mature technologies that we know how they work. We know the costs, so like wind, solar, and batteries. We may need to add some new things like pump storage, but pump storage is simply a different form of hydro, and we've been using that for more than 100 years. Can you go to the next slide? I'm a gas customer. I have a gas furnace. It's about 10 years old, and that's a little early to replace it. I also have a daughter in college, so it would be a pretty big cost for me to replace it right now. And when I do get to the point of replacing it, I have to consider and think about what's the price risk associated with staying with the natural gas system as they go through this massive decarbonization. I have to think about the carbon risk, if the climate risk. If I'm staying with gas, I'm continuing to put emissions into the atmosphere and damage the planet. And then I lose the efficient cooling of a heat pump and have to go to window units or other things that simply aren't as efficient and cost higher to cool my house. And as we saw again from last year's heat dome, it's getting hot in the summers. We have lots of days over 90 degrees, and air conditioning is becoming more and more necessary in our climate. Whereas the alternative electrification reduces combustion of fossil fuels, and it therefore reduces the cost and risk of decarbonizing the gas system. And that's really important. Where we electrify some gas load, we benefit the other customers of the gas system because they don't have to decarbonize as much themselves. You can meet that 2035 69% goal easier and at a lower cost when some folks start to decarbonize. And then I also just want to applaud what Eloise had said about equity, because that's a big concern here. As the gas system begins to shrink, the folks who are most likely to be left on the system, and they're going to have to pay more because the remaining costs of the pipelines will then be charged to a smaller set of customers. And those are the customers who can't invest in heat pumps. The customers on the gas system will become lower income, they're going to become poorer. And they're going to be taking on more and more of the costs of the gas system in terms of pipeline and other costs. And they're going to be paying for renewable gas and hydrogen and things that are much more expensive. This isn't a surprise. This is a normal way transitions work. Folks at the bottom get left behind. We have an opportunity to do things differently with the gas transition, but only if we plan, only if we implement policies to do it differently, only if we're intentional in what we do. A good example of that, if we make heat pumps standard in low-income weatherization programs, we're bringing efficient cooling and heating to low-income customers on the front end, not on the back end, and we're lowering both the costs and the comfort for low-income customers' homes. So we can do this in an equitable manner, but we've got to think about it, we've got to be intentional, and we really have to act to start to reduce our gas emissions, or the system's simply not going to work. So can you go to the last slide? So I just want to thank folks for inviting me. I tried to go pretty fast through here. I did want to leave some time for questions. I know it's getting pretty late, but I do want to say for folks who are interested in CUB, come to our website, join us, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and join our email list. We try to put out a lot of good information for customers to help customers make these kinds of decisions, and we'd love to have more of you looking at the work we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. And yes, we do have a little bit of time for questions, and I do want to move straight into that. And I do apologize that we ended up so short on time. We covered so much information tonight. So I know that we have Craig Patterson with a raised hand. Craig, I'm going to enable you to speak so you can ask your question. But I believe you will have that. Yes, perfect.
Yeah, thank you. I've been involved in energy issues now for 45 years or so, and I've been a member of Lane Electric Co-op for 51 years. And I've wrapped water heaters in the 70s, sold solar solariums and copper cricket hot water systems in the 80s, and done professional energy services work in the 90s. So I have a lot of background. What concerns me is that 50 years ago, when electricity was 1 cent a kilowatt, electric heat made a lot of sense, and most houses were electrically heated back then. But today, your electric costs are more like 10 or 15 cents a kilowatt. And so electric heat is far more problematic. And one of the aspects of that has to do with energy density. Electric heat is not energy dense. Nuclear is the most energy dense, but has significant problems, obviously. Whereas gas is probably the second most energy dense, and is why the conversion to gas heat has been continuous as electric prices have gone up. But there's a couple more issues here that need to be discussed, including the fact that biomass is 30 times dirtier than coal and 300 times dirtier than natural gas because of that energy density factor. And the Seneca biomass plant, just north of Eugene, which eWeb has entered into a non-disclosure contract for 15 years, meaning they don't want to talk about it. And yet there was an editorial saying that they are receiving, I think it's 8.7 cents a kilowatt hour for that power when they pay BPA's wholesale rate of 3.59 cents. So not only is Eugene getting the pollution for free, they're paying almost 3 times what it really should, what the wholesale rate is. So I would suggest that there's a couple of areas that are more important, frankly, than electric heated houses going forward. And that is conservation. And when conservation was deemed the #1 regional priority in the 1980 Power Planning Council bill, it has been highly problematic. And the focus on conservation of late has really been more about either the low-hanging fruit or high tech. The upshot is that 80% of the benefit is going to 20% of the clients who can afford out-of-pocket expense. So conservation has not done a very good job relative to weatherization, relative to the envelope of the house, when there are very many substandard houses out there that need weatherization. So I would suggest that you look at some of these other areas first before just focusing on all electric houses going into the future. Thank you very much.
This is Bob. Let me respond to that. And Craig, you and I have been talking about these issues for many years. I appreciate your comments. Conservation has to be part of the answer. We need to continue to invest in conservation. I do a lot of work with the investor-owned utilities to make sure that we're doing that. We have the Energy Trust to help do that. We need folks in Lane County to continue to push EWEB and the consumer-owned utilities down there to continue to invest in conservation. We need to make every building as energy efficient as possible. We need to weatherize. We need those shells fully insulated. We need good windows. We need everything. But we also have to look at our usage within that. An electric heat pump is much more efficient than a gas furnace. It's 300% efficient because you're using the electricity for pumping, not for resistance heating. So you're moving the air from a cooler place to a warmer place, or you're moving heat from a cooler place to a warmer place, and that's what's creating and warming or cooling your house. You're pumping heat out of your house or you're pumping heat into your house. It's an amazingly efficient technology. It works. It's been around now for a decade or more in commercial applications. So I don't disagree. We need to make the shell. We need to weatherize. We need to put more insulation in. We need better windows. A lot of work is going in the Northwest to that. But we also have to make sure our utilities are focusing on installing advanced heating equipment, that we're not heating our homes with resistance heat. We're not heating our homes. We're heating our homes with the most efficient heat possible. And right now, that's a heat pump. A heat pump will save us money. It will give us efficient cooling, and it reduces climate pollution, which right now is a key need for all of us. So, but I completely agree. It's not one or the other. It's all of the above.
Thank you so much.
If I could respond briefly.
Actually, we have a couple other questions, Craig. Could we circle back to you after we've responded to those? I'm so sorry. I just want to, we only have 3 more minutes and we have 2 more questions to tackle. So yes, I just want to make sure that we cover these other questions. So Gus Glazer asks how expensive, so this kind of relates, how expensive in electricity dollars to kilowatts in Eugene versus other areas of the state or US? Does anyone have a good response to that question?
Generally, Eugene's cheap is on the lower side. I don't have exact figures in front of me, but EWEB, the base of their power comes from the Bonneville hydro system. Hydro is some of the cheapest power we have because it doesn't require a fuel. I'm working right now with Pacific Power. I'm working on their rate cases. They're looking at an increase of about 18% for their customers next year. Part of that is going to things like cleaning up their coal plants, which EWEB doesn't have to face because they've got that clean energy system. And because they start with a pretty clean energy system, they're not going to have to put in costs for decarbonization. So you've got a relatively low cost system down there in Lane County compared to the rest of the country or compared to a lot of the investor-owned utilities in the region. But that will get better over time because you also got a clean system and you don't need to decarbonize it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. So we have a question from Paula. I am in favor of electrification and have solar. However, I have concerns regarding the impacts of lithium mining. The pending mines in Eastern Oregon are being fought by a coalition of tribes, enviros, and ranchers. It's not clear what the water consumption or pollution impact will be. Are hemp batteries a reality? What are other alternatives are there for energy storage? Anyone who is interested in answering, please unmute.
I can answer. There's a lot of research going on in alternative batteries. There's folks, Toyota and other folks are looking at solid state batteries. There's folks looking at ion batteries. There's lots of different alternatives. There's huge money. There's lots of venture capital going into figuring how can we do this better and how can we do this with lower cost and with materials that have an easier supply chain. So a lot of that's happening. I don't know. I don't predict technology because I'm always wrong when I try to. So I don't know where those will go. There's also storage things like pumped hydro that can help, and that are really simply hydro, old-fashioned hydro technology. And then there's other technologies that like offshore wind and other things that blow it that come in at a different time that are renewable and are blow much more often that would also help our energy system. So we can get a lot of the use of need for batteries through a diversity of resources, or we can get it through sort of new technologies that are coming along. But we are lots of money is looking into how do you store this stuff, and I think that problem is a solvable problem. And I don't think lithium will likely be what we're using 15 years from now. But I don't want to predict technology because I will be wrong.
Wonderful. We are at 7:30. If anyone else wanted to weigh in on that or any of the other questions, I just wanted to give that opportunity before I wrap things up. All righty. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I just quickly wanted to do my last little plug for Fossil Free Eugene. There are a lot of ways to plug in, and I don't really have time to go over them, but I did just want to bring up this slide here. We encourage anyone who is interested in supporting the cause to testify. City Council has been wonderful listening to many hours of our testimony, and it is a great way to really show what constituents want. So if you're interested, please contact us for more information on how you can do that. There are some other ways to support the Fossil Free Eugene campaign. You can take home order a Fossil Free Eugene sign. They are free. They are delivered free. You can complete an action on our website. I'll put the links to those in the chat here in just a moment. You can pass a resolution at your neighborhood level. You can follow us on social media or share our calls to action, join our mailing list, or for other opportunities, please feel free to email me with the longest email in the world, fossilfreeeugenecoordinator@gmail.com, for other ways to get involved. So I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists for sharing their expertise and their knowledge. We covered a lot here, and we probably could have kept going quite a bit longer. So I really appreciate you all taking the time, sharing with us and all the work you do in your respective organizations for this and other causes. I also want to thank you everyone for attending, for caring enough about our community and its future to join in this conversation. I wish we could have had more discussion and questions, but I would like to invite you all to keep it going. We will be having another webinar on the legal and implementation side of what this ordinance would be for our community. I will make sure that my time management is more on point, and we will leave ample time for discussion at that webinar. And I also invite you to please send me questions. I'm sure I cannot answer all of your questions as well as many other folks, so I will direct you to the right person or get the correct answer for you. So please feel free to email me, and we can keep the discussion going and work on talking about your concerns and how we can best serve everybody as we move forward to a fossil-free future. So have a great night, and together we can make a just transition to a livable future. Thank you so much.